Tides of Darkness, Chapter 1. Despite himself, Lothar was impressed. Stormwind had been a towering, imposing city, filled with spires and terraces, carved from strong stone to resist the wind, but polished to a mere sheen. But in its own way, Capital City was equally lovely. Not that Capital City was the same as Stormwind. It was not as tall, for one. But what it lacked in height, it made up for in elegance. It sat on a rise above the north shore of Lordamere Lake, gleaming all in white and silver. It did not glitter as Stormwind had, but it glowed somehow, as if the sun were rising from its graceful buildings instead of beating down upon them. It seemed serene, peaceful, almost holy. "It is a mighty place," Khadgar agreed beside him, "though I prefer a little more warmth." He glanced behind them, toward the lake's southern shore, where a second city rose. Its outlines were similar to those of Capital City, but this mirror image seemed more exotic. Its walls and spires suffused in violet and other warm hues. "That is Dalaran," he explained. "Home of the Kirin Tor and its wizards. My home, before I was sent to Medivh."
"Perhaps there will be time for you to return, at least briefly," Lothar suggested. "But for now we must concentrate on the capital city."
He studied the gleaming city again.
"Let us hope they are noble in their thoughts as they are in their dwellings."
He kicked his horse into a canter and rode down out of the majestic silver pine forest. Varian and the mage right behind him, and the other men trailing them in their carts. 2 hours later, they reached the main gates. Guards stood by the entrance, though the double gates were wide open and large enough for 2 or even 3 wagons to pass a breeze. The guards had clearly seen them long before they reached the gates, and the one who stepped forward wore a crimson cloak over his polished breastplate and had gold traceries in his armor and helmet. His manner was polite, even respectful, but Lothar could not help noticing how the man stopped only a few feet away, well, within sword range. He forced himself to relax and ignore the laxity. This was not Stormwind. These people were not seasoned warriors, hardened by constant battle. They had never had to fight for their lives yet. "Enter freely and be welcome," the guard captain stated, bowing. "Marcus Redpath warned us of your arrival and your plight. You will find the king in his throne room." "Our thanks," Khadgar replied with a nod. "Come, Lothar," he added, nudging his horse with his heels. "I know the way." They rode on through the city, navigating its broad streets easily. Khadgar did indeed seem to know the way, and never slowed to ask directions or puzzle over a turn until they had reached the palace itself. There they surrendered their horses to some of their companions, leaving them to mind the steeds. Lothar and Prince Varian were already striding up the palace-wide steps, and Khadgar quickly joined them. They stepped through the palace's outer doors and into a wide courtyard, almost an outdoor hall. Viewing boxes lined the sides, and though empty now, Lothar was sure they filled with people during celebration. At the far end, another short flight of steps led up to a second set of doors, and these opened onto the throne room itself. It was an imposing chamber, its arched ceiling so high overhead its edges were lost in shadow. The room was round, with arches and columns everywhere. Golden sunlight streamed down from a stained glass panel set in the ceiling's center, illuminating the intricate pattern in the floor. A series of nestled circles, each one different, with a triangle at their middle overlapping the innermost ring, and the golden seal of Lordaeron within that. It had several high balconies, and Lothar guessed these were for nobles, but also appreciated their strategic value. A few guards with bows could easily strike anywhere in the room from those vantage points. Just beyond the pattern stood a wide circular dais, its concentric steps rising up toward a massive throne. The throne itself looked carved from glittering stone, all sharp edges and planes and angles. A man sat there, tall and broad, his blond hair only lightly touched by gray, his armor gleaming. the crown upon his head shaped more like a spiked helmet than a coronet. This was a proper king. A king like his Lane, who did not hesitate to fight for his people. His hopes rose at the thought. There were people here, townsfolk and laborers, and even peasants, gathered facing the dais from a respectful distance. Many carried items, scraps of parchment, even food. But they parted before Lothar and Khadgar, falling away from the pair without a sound. "Yes," the man on the throne called out as they approached. "Who are you, and what do you wish of me?" Even from here, Lothar could see the king's strangely colored eyes, blue and green swirled together. They were sharp and clear, and his hopes rose still further. He was a man who saw well and clearly.
"Your Majesty,"
Lothar replied, his deep voice carrying easily across the large room. He stopped several paces from the dais and bowed.
"I am Anduin Lothar, a knight of Stormwind. This is my companion, Khadgar of Delaran."
He heard several murmurs from the crowd now behind them.
"And this,"
he turned so that the king could see Varian, who had been standing behind him, unnerved by the crowd and the strange trappings,
"is Prince Varian Wern, heir to the throne of Stormwind."
The murmurs turned to gasp as people realized the youth was visiting royalty. But Lothar ignored them, concentrating only on the king.
"We must speak with you, Your Majesty. It is a matter of great urgency and major import."
Of course. Tyrannus was already rising from his throne and approaching them. "Leave us, please," he asked the rest of the crowd, though it was an order despite its polite wording. The people obeyed quickly, and soon only a handful of nobles and guards remained. The man who had accompanied Lothar faded back to the sides as well, leaving only Lothar, Khadgar, and Varian when Tyrannus closed the distance between them. "Your Majesty," Tyrannus greeted Varian, bowing to him as to an equal. "Your Majesty," Varian replied, his training overcoming his shock. "We were grieved to hear of your father's death," Tyrannus continued gently. "King Lane was a good man, and we counted him as a friend and an ally. Know that we shall do all in our power to restore you to your throne." "I thank you," Varian said, though his lower lip trembled slightly. "Now come and sit and tell me what has happened," Tyrannus instructed, gesturing to the dais steps. He sat on the top one himself and motioned for Varian to sit beside him. "I have seen Stormwind myself, and admired its strength and beauty. What could destroy such a city?" "The Horde," Khadgar said, speaking for the first time since they had entered the throne room. Tyrannus turned toward him, and Lothar was close enough to see the king's eyes narrow slightly. "The Horde did this? And what is this Horde?" Tyrannus demanded, turning first to Varian and then to Lothar.
"It is an army, more than an army,"
Lothar replied.
"It is a multitude more than can be counted, enough to cover the land from shore to shore."
"And who commands this legion of men?" Tyrannus asked.
"Not men,"
Lothar corrected.
"Orcs."
At the king's puzzlement, Lothar explained.
"A new race, one not native to this world. They are as tall as we are, and more powerfully built, with green skin and glowing red eyes, and great tusks from the lower lips."
A noble snorted somewhere, and Lothar turned, glaring.
"You doubt me?"
he shouted, turning toward each of the balconies in turn, looking for the one who had laughed.
"You think I lie?"
He struck his armor with his fist, near one of the more prominent dents.
"This was made by an orc warhammer."
He struck another spot.
"And this by an orc war axe."
He pointed to a gash along one forearm.
"And this came from a tusk when one jumped me and was too close for our blades to strike one another. These foul creatures have destroyed my land, my home, my people. If you doubt me, come down here and say it to my face. I will show you what sort of man I am, and what happens to those who accuse me of falsehood."
"Enough!" Tyrannus shouted, silenced any possible reply. Anger playing in his own voice. But when he turned to Lothar, the warrior could see that this king's anger was not directed at him. "Enough," the king said again, more softly. "None here doubt your word, champion," he assured Lothar, a stern look around daring any of his nobles to disagree. "I know of you, of your honor and your loyalty. I will take you at your word, though such creatures sound strange to us." He turned and nodded at Khadgar, and with one of the wizards of Dalaran beside you as witness, we cannot discount what you say, nor the notion of races never seen here before."
"I thank you, King Tyrannus,"
Lothar replied formally, reining his anger back in. He was not sure what to do next. Fortunately, Tyrannus was. "I will summon my neighboring kings," he announced. "These events concern us all." He turned back toward Varian. "Your Majesty, I offer you my home and my protection for as long as you shall need it," he stated, loud enough for all to hear. "When you are ready, know that Lordaeron will assist you in reclaiming your kingdom." Lothar nodded.
"Your Majesty, you are most generous,"
he said on Varian's behalf.
"and I can think of no safer and finer place for my prince to reach his maturity than here in Capital City. Know, however, that we did not come here merely for sanctuary. We came to warn you."
He stood tall, his voice rumbling across the room, his eyes not leaving Lordaeron's king.
"For know this, the Horde will not stop at Stormwind. They mean to claim the entire world, and they have the might and the numbers to make their dream a reality. Nor do they lack magical might. Once they have finished with my homeland,"
his voice grew deeper and rougher, and he forced himself to continue,
"they will find a way across the ocean, and they will come here."
"You are telling us to prepare for war," Tyrannus said quietly. It was not a question, but Lothar answered nonetheless.
"Yes."
He looked around at the assembled men.
"A war for the very survival of our race."
End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Ogrim Doomhammer, chieftain of the Blackrock clan and war chief of the Horde, surveyed the scene. He stood near the center of Stormwind as his warriors destroyed the once great city around him. Everywhere he turned, there was destruction and devastation. Buildings burned despite being made of stone. Bodies and rubble littered the streets. Blood flowed across the flagstones, pooling here and there. Screams indicated that survivors had been found and were being tortured. Doomhammer nodded. It was good. Stormwind had been an imposing city and a powerful obstacle. For a time he had not been sure they could topple its great walls, or overwhelm its stalwart defenders. Despite the Horde's superior numbers, the humans had fought back with skill and determination. Doomhammer respected them for that. They had been worthy opponents, yet they had fallen, as all must, before his people's might. The city had been breached, and its defenders killed or run off. And now this land was theirs, this rich, fertile land, so like their own homeworld had been before the cataclysm, before Gul'dan and his folly had destroyed it. Doomhammer's thoughts turned grim, and his grip tightened on his fabled hammer. Gul'dan, the treacherous shaman-turned-warlock, had caused more trouble than he was worth. Only his opening the rift to this new world had saved him from being torn apart by enraged clansmen. Yet somehow, the schemer had turned even that to his advantage. He had taken control of Blackhand, or perhaps he had always had it. Doomhammer had watched his former chieftain for years, and knew the massive orc warrior had been smarter than he let on, but not smart enough. And by playing to Blackhand's ego, Gul'dan had swayed him and taken control. He had been behind the plan to unite the clans into the Horde. Doomhammer was sure of that. And Gul'dan's Shadow Council had ruled from behind the scenes, advising Blackhand in such a way that he never realized they were, in fact, issuing orders. Doomhammer grinned. That at least was ended now. He had not been pleased at being forced to kill Blackhand. He had been the war chief's second and sworn to fight beside him, not against him. But tradition allowed a warrior to challenge his chieftain for supremacy, and Doomhammer had finally been forced to take that route. He had won, as he knew he must, and with the blow that crushed Blackhand's skull, he had taken control of their clan, and of the Horde. That had left the Shadow Council to deal with, and that had been a pleasure. He chuckled at the memory. Few orcs had even known of the Shadow Council's existence, much less its membership and sanctuary. But Doomhammer had guessed whom to ask. The half-orc Garona had been tortured into revealing the council's location. No doubt her non-orc blood made her too weak to withstand much. The look on the warlock's face as he had burst into their meeting had been priceless, and even more so their expressions as he had advanced through the room, slaughtering them left and right. Doomhammer had shattered the power of the Shadow Council that day. He would not be controlled as Blackhand had. He would choose his own battles, and make his own plans, not to increase anyone's power, but to ensure his people's survival. As if thinking of him had been a summons, Doomhammer spotted two figures approaching him down the broad, bloodied street. One was shorter than an average orc, the other far taller, and with a strange shape. Doomhammer knew them at once, and his lips curled away from his tusks in a sneer.
"Have you completed your task, then?"
he called out as Gul'dan and his lackey Cho'Gall approached. He kept his gaze on the warlock, barely sparing a sharp glance at his hulking subordinate. Doomhammer had fought ogres all his life, as had most orcs. He had been disgusted with Blackhand when he forged an alliance with the monstrous creatures, though he admitted they had their use in combat, but he still did not like or trust them, and Cho'Gall was worse than most. He was one that rare breed, the two-headed ogre, and had far more intelligence than his brutish brethren. Cho'Gall was a mage in his own right, and the idea an ogre with such power filled Doomhammer with dread. Plus, Cho'Gall had gained control of the Twilight Hammer's clan. He showed the same fanaticism as the orcs who followed him. That made the two-headed ogre very dangerous. Not that Doomhammer would ever let such concerns show, but he kept his grip on his hammer tight whenever the ogre mage was near.
"I have not, noble Doomhammer,"
Gul'dan replied, stopping beside him. The warlock looked thin, but otherwise no worse for his months-long slumber.
"But I have at last shaken off the last effects of my prolonged slumber, and I bring powerful news drawn from that same long repose."
"Oh, and your sleep has brought you wisdom?"
"It has shown me the path to great power,"
Gul'dan admitted, lust clear in his eyes. But Doomhammer knew it was not an ordinary lust, not for females or fine food or wealth. Gul'dan thought only of power, and would do anything to obtain it. His actions on their own world had proven that.
"Power for you or for the Horde?"
Doomhammer demanded.
"For both,"
the warlock replied. His voice dropped to a sly whisper.
"I have seen a place ancient beyond imagine, older even than the sacred mountain of our homeworld. It lies deep beneath the wave, and it within rests a power that could reshape this world. We would claim it as our own, and none can stand against us." "None can stand against us now,"
Doomhammer growled back.
"And I prefer the honest might of hammer and axe to whatever foul sorcerers you have uncovered. Look what you're scheming to do our world, and to our people the last time. I will not have you destroy them further, or wreck this new world just as we have begun to conquer it. That is far greater than your desire."
The warlock snapped, his temper brushing aside any pretense of civility.
"My destiny lies beneath the water, and there is little you can do to stop that. This horde is but the first step in our people's path, and it shall be I who lead them beyond here, not you."
"Have a care, warlock," Doomhammer replied, his hammer coming up to tap Gul'dan lightly on the cheek.
"Remember what happened to your precious Shadow Consul. I can crush your skull in an instant, and then where will your destiny lie?"
He looked up at the towering Cho'Gall.
"And do not think this abomination will save you,"
he snarled, raising the hammer higher and laughing as the ogre mage stepped back, fear washing across both his faces.
"I have felled ogres before, even the Groton. I can and will do so again."
He leaned in, close.
"Your goals are no longer important. Only the Horde matters."
For an instant, he saw anger flicker in Gul'dan's eyes, and thought the warlock might not back down, and part of him rejoiced. Doomhammer had always admired and revered his people's shaman, as had all orcs. But these warlocks were something far different. Their power did not come from the elements or ancestor spirits, but from some other horrible source. It had been their magic that had turned his people from wholesome brown to gruesome green, and was killing their own world, forcing them to come here just to survive. And Gul'dan was their leader, their instigator, by far the most powerful, most cunning, and most selfish of them all. Doomhammer knew the warlock's value to the Horde, but he could not help but feel they would all be better off without them. Perhaps Gul'dan saw this in his own eyes, for the anger vanished, replaced by caution and grudging respect.
Of course, mighty Doomhammer,
the warlock said, dropping his head.
You are correct. The Horde must come first.
He grinned, fully recovered from his fright. The anger apparently gone, or at least buried deep once more.
And I have many new ideas to aid our conquest. But first, I shall deliver the warriors I promised, unstoppable but fully under your control.
Doomhammer nodded slowly.
Very well. I will not ignore anything that could make our success more assured.
He turned away, dismissing the warlock and his lieutenant, and Gul'dan took the hint, bowing and walking away, Cho'Gall stomping along beside him. Doomhammer knew he would have to watch both of them very closely. Gul'dan was not one to take an insult lightly, or to allow anyone to control him for long. But until the warlock stepped out of line, his magic would be useful, and Doomhammer would take full advantage of that. The sooner they crushed any opposition, the sooner his people could set aside their weapons and turn to building homes and families once more. With that in mind, Doomhammer sought out another of his lieutenants, finding him at last in what had once been a great hall, feasting upon the food and drink they had found there.
Zulahead.
The orc shaman glanced up as Doomhammer shouted his name, and quickly stood, pushing away the goblet and platter before him. Though old and thin and shriveled, Zulahad's red-brown eyes were still sharp beneath his tattered grey braids.
Doomhammer?
Unlike Gul'dan, Zulahad did not snivel or bow, and Doomhammer respected that. But then Zulahad was a chieftain in his own right, the head of the Dragon Hall clan. He was also a shaman, the only shaman to have accompanied the Horde, and it was those abilities and what they might provide that interested Doomhammer.
How goes the work?
Doomhammer did not bother with pleasantries, though he did accept the goblet Zulahad offered him. The wine within it was fine indeed, and the traces of human blood that had spilled into it only enhanced the flavor.
The same?
The Dragonmaw leader replied, disgust written plainly across his features. Months ago, Zulahad had approached, telling Doomhammer of strange visions that had plagued him. Visions of a particular mountain range, and of a mighty treasure buried deep beneath it. A treasure not of wealth, but of power. Doomhammer respected the older chieftain, and remembered the power of a shaman's visions from their own homeworld. He had approved Zulahad's request to lead his clan in search of that mountain and the power it concealed. It had taken weeks, but at last the Dragonmaw clan had found a cavern deep in the earth, and within it, a strange object, a golden disc they had named the Demon's Soul. Though Doomhammer had not seen the artifact himself, Zulahad had assured him that it radiated immense age and incredible power. Unfortunately, that power was proving difficult to obtain.
You assured me you could trigger its power,
Doomhammer reminded, tossing the empty goblet aside. It struck the far wall with a dull crunch.
And it shall,
Zulahad assured him.
The Demon's Soul contains immense resources, enough power to shatter mountains and tear open the sky.
He frowned.
But thus far, it has resisted my magics.
He shook his head.
But I will find the key. I know it. I have seen it in my dreams. And once we can tap its power, we shall use it to enslave our chosen servants. And with them, beneath us we shall rule the skies, and rain fire down upon those who stand against us.
Excellent. Doomhammer clapped the other orc on the shoulder. The shaman's fanaticism worried him from time to time, especially since Zulahad did not seem to live entirely in this world. But he had no doubts of his loyalty. That was why he had supported the old orc's quest. When he had spurned Gul'dan's request to embark on a similarly vision-based search for power, Doomhammer knew that, whatever else happened, Zulahad would not turn against him or against their people. And if this Demon's Soul could do half of what Zulahad had promised, if it enabled the shaman to make his visions a reality, it would indeed ensure the Horde's superiority in battle.
Send word when all is ready. Of course.
Zulahad saluted him with his own goblet, which he refilled from a blood-smeared golden pitcher. Doomhammer left the shaman to his celebration and resumed his wanderings through the fallen city. He liked to see what his warriors were doing firsthand, and he knew that seeing their leader walking among them gave the others a sense that he was one of them, bonding them to him even more tightly. Blackhand had known that as well, making sure his orcs saw him as a fellow warrior, as well as a chieftain, and later war chief. It was one of the lessons Doomhammer had learned well from his predecessors. His meeting with Zulahad had wiped away the sour taste Gul'dan had left in his mouth, and as he stalked through the streets, Doomhammer found his spirits high. His people had achieved a great victory here, and deserved to celebrate. He would let them enjoy themselves for a few days. Then they would move on to the next target. Gul'dan watched Doomhammer from a few buildings away.
"What are he and Zulahad planning?"
he demanded, not turning away from glaring at the war chiefs retreating back.
"I do not know,"
Jolgal admitted.
"They have been secretive about it. I know it involves something in the dragon maw found in the mountains. Half that clan is there now, but I do not know what they are doing."
"Well, it does not matter." Gul'dan frowned, rubbing absently at one tusk as he thought.
"Whatever it is, it serves to keep Doomhammer distracted, and that works to our advantage. It would not do for him to uncover our own plans before we can set them in motion." He grinned. "And then it will be too late for him." "Will you replace him as war chief?"
Jolgal's other head asked as they moved away, returning to the quarters that had been set aside for them.
"Myself, no. I have no desire to march through the streets with an axe or a hammer, meeting my foes in flesh," he admitted. "My path is the far greater one. I shall meet them in spirit and crush them from afar, devouring them by the hundreds and the thousands."
He smiled at the thought.
"Soon all that was promised me shall be mine, and then Doomhammer will be as nothing against me. Even the might of the Horde will pale before me, and I shall stretch out my hand and wipe this world clean to make it my own image."
He laughed again, and the sound came back to him from the tumbled walls and torn buildings, as if the dying city were laughing with him. End of chapter 2.